Hi, everybody. It's Brad Truex from Eastman's Woodlands and Wildlife Committee. And today we're going to do an update on wildfire risk management. Uh, Again, winter in New Hampshire is not a time of high risk for wildfires, but the devastating wildfires on the West Coast have really dominated the news lately. So, an update on wildlife risk is certainly in order at this point in time. We did have drought conditions here this past fall that were associated with an increased risk for wildfire, including some red rains. There were articles in the Valley News and on NHPR on the wildfire risk, and you might have even received some alerts on your smartphones about it. Here in New Hampshire and Vermont and the Upper Valley, there have been fires on Moose Mountain, Killington, an island in the Merrimack River, and Bradford. Climate change has certainly changed the risks, and emerald ash borer is probably also leading to a slightly higher risk. And the COVID epidemic increased the human forest interface that significantly increases the wildfire risk. So wildfires do occur in New Hampshire. There's actually an average of 175 wildfires per year here in New Hampshire, though only about 225 acres on average are affected. But some biggies have occurred in the past. The most obvious one is the 1953 Grantham Mountain Fire. That lasted 3 months, and you can see the bare granite on Grantham Mountain today as a result of that fire. In 1917, there was the Dilly Cliff Fire in North Woodstock that burned 75 acres and lasted over a month. So again, in 2024, New Hampshire did have frequent wildfires this past fall. Wildfires are usually more frequent in the spring, but the drought conditions combined with dry air, low humidity, strong winds led to many fires in the Northeast in 2024, particularly in the fall. And ground fires are more common early in the year, but surface fires or brush fires are much more common in the fall. And dry fallen leaves tend to be a good fuel source. Wildfires also occurred in Vermont in 2024. They had the most wildfires since 2016. And up to December, there were 82 wildfires in Vermont, all of which were caused by humans. In all, they burned about 159 acres. There was one where there was improper ash disposal that actually burned 70 acres. And more than half of those fires in Vermont occurred in October and November, compared to the more typical prevalence in the spring. So once again, the drought conditions that we had in this area in the fall were significant contributors to the wildfire risk. Wildfire risk in New Hampshire. Again, wildfires are most common in spring and in the fall. In the spring, they're usually due to people returning. In the fall, they're usually due to drier air and more leaves falling to the ground. Ground fires are more common early in the year, but surface and brush fires are more common in the fall. So again, climate change has significantly increased the risk for wildfires almost everywhere. You have higher temperatures. Now precipitation occurs in spurts that are separated by long dry spells, and conditions tend to be windier. We have a smaller snowpack in recent years, and water tables have been lower. Drought conditions dry out the foliage and the underlying soil. And with severe drought, there's also loss of moisture in deeper layers of the forest floor, which makes ground fires much more of a consideration. So fires can actually smolder up to 2 feet deep and actually last for months at a time. We need to address two issues to mitigate the wildfire risk. One is a proactive prevention, and the second is knowing what to do if there is an actual fire. So again, this is the fire triangle. In order to have a fire, you need oxygen, fuel, and a heat source. So again, the heat sources could be lightning strikes, heat from the sun, sparks from almost anything like vehicles, machinery, generators, metal scraping against rocks, power lines, and a bunch of other things. Electrical transformers, campfires, discarded cigarettes, improperly burning debris, fireworks, playing with matches, arson, chimney fires, prescribed fires that go wrong. And wood's flash point is 572 degrees Fahrenheit, at which it releases hydrocarbon gases that mix with oxygen and combust and create fire. So there are plenty of fuels for wildfires around as well. Surface fuels include leaves, pine needles, dead branches, grasses, coarse woody debris, or what we call slash, and fuel ladders, which I'll show you a picture of in a couple minutes. Trees are fuels, and almost any wood structure, houses, sheds, and other things. There's also a fire behavior triangle, in addition to the fire triangle. Again, spread intensity of fire really depends on three factors. One is the amount and the arrangement of fuel, two is the topography, and three is the weather conditions. So any change in one factor during a fire can really alter its behavior and its type. So here are some features of fire behavior. Torching basically is movement of a surface fire up to the tree crowns, and that's the precursor of what we call a crown fire. Crowning is active movement of fire through the tree canopy, so it's bouncing from one tree to another. Fire whirl it forms as a result of the upward spinning column of air that carries flames, smoke, and embers upward. And often this forms from heavy fuels on the downwind side, particularly ridges. And in extreme conditions, it can be powerful enough to twist off entire trees. And spotting is when firebrands, which are the glowing embers, get lofted up and move ahead of the main front. And they can ignite multiple spot fires that then feed back to the main fire, creating a very dangerous situation. Particularly in those recent fires out in Los Angeles, this was a big problem. The glowing embers were jumping from one place to another. So again, this is showing torching. Here, the surface fire is spread upward toward the crown. These are stages of a crown fire. Hopefully, we'll never experience a crown fire here in New Hampshire. This is showing spotting, which again are these embers or so-called firebrands, which are now spreading one to another and so on. Conditions that make an environment ripe for wildfires include extended drought, high winds, and high temperature, and low humidity. Steep slopes, fuel buildup, particularly on the ground. And we have little control over any of these things except for the latter, fuel buildup. Red flag warnings are given when there is extended drought, dry air, and high winds. As I mentioned, we did have some red flag warnings here in New Hampshire this past fall, and certainly out on the West Coast and in the Maui fire that occurred a year ago in Hawaii. Red flag warnings were present for several days prior to the actual fires breaking out. So again, there are three types of forest wildfire. The ground fire, and these basically can smolder underground for several months. The surface fire, that would be the common brush fire, and the crown fire. That's the most serious form of a wildfire, and it no longer requires surface fuels because it's jumping from one tree to another. So in terms of wildfire risk mitigation, the most serious loss of property and human life occurs when relatively uncommon severe brush fire gets driven by extreme fire weather, rather than the more typical annual summer brush fires. And under extreme conditions, highly intense fires that burn foliage in the treetops, which again we mentioned are crown fires, are more likely to happen regardless of the underlying fuel loads. And in those circumstances, the fire is more likely to spread by spotting with firebrands. These are these windblown burning embers, and they actually jump well ahead of the actual fire front. The wildfire risk at Eastman, we have two existing documents, both of which probably need updating. In 2005, there was a fire and wildlife assessment done by University of New Hampshire, and it mentioned that we're at relatively low risk for wildfires. And in 2008, the town of Grantham did a hazard mitigation plan that also addressed wildfire risk, but it also noted a high risk of structural fires here at Eastman, mainly because we have a lot of old wooden homes and some of them are close together. Neither really addresses the response to a wildfire, and neither report takes into account what's happened with accelerated climate change, which includes higher temperatures, more drought, and windier conditions, or the impact of either emerald ash borer or the impact of having increased people here at Eastman after the COVID epidemic. There is a separate town of Grantham operations plan that really says very little about response to a wildfire. This is an old photo. This I think was from about 19 or about 2020, and it actually shows that we're in a relatively low risk for wildfires, and that's primarily because we don't have a lot of grasses and surface fuels that are especially likely to lead to a major wildfire. However, if you look at the most recent drought map, and this is updated actually as of January of 2025, you can see that we're still in an area of moderate drought. So again, conditions for wildfires have not disappeared here. An important concept is the wildland-urban interface, and this basically is a zone of transition between wildlands and human development. And so areas where human-made structures and infrastructure occur, like cell towers, schools, water supply, etc., are in or adjacent to areas that are prone to wildfire. So these are areas at risk for catastrophic fires. And Eastman certainly is a classical wildland-urban interface because, again, we have lots of forest here, and we have lots of these human-made structures that are basically adjacent or actually within the forests. And remember, humans are actually the leading cause of wildfires. The old Smokey the Bear warning, only you can prevent forest fires, certainly applies. So again, because Eastman is a classic wildland-urban interface, any fire is likely to begin near homes or buildings. Eastman already did have a major fire that destroyed the Eastman Community Center back in 1995. And human activities will likely contribute to or to a cause of a wildfire or propagation of a wildfire. So it's really up to all of us to take steps to mitigate the risk. You need to have a plan for how you would react if a fire occurred. And slope is also a major factor in wildfire spread. Fire usually travels faster uphill than downhill. Winds generally move uphill, and the rising smoke and sparks and flames in dried out areas dry out the areas above a fire, making them more prone to be ignited as well. So once an area is burned, it's harder for the fire to move back downhill. So are there implications for Eastman? Well, Eastman does have some portions that are basically uphill. So I'm thinking about Snow Hill, maybe Brook Ridge, probably some other areas that are a little further out. And this basically is showing a plume of smoke in a flat area tends to go straight up, but if you have a slope, it goes up the slope. Wildfire fuel types are important. And again, if you look at these two pictures, in this picture, there are lots of hazards. You have what we call a fire ladder here, where fire could go right up this tree. We have branches that are really adjacent to this wooden structure. And on this side, it's a little bit better because they've cleared out those risks. So again, the fuel types, surface fuels, again, are leaves, pine needles, dead branches, grasses, and coarse woody brush, or what we refer to as slash. But fuel ladders are also important, and that's where you could have fire that burns upward from the ground up into some higher levels. So again, this is showing some coarse woody debris, what we might refer to as slash. A fuel ladder, basically this is live or dead vegetation that allows the fire to climb upwards from the landscape or the forest floor toward the tree canopy. And common fuel ladders would include tall grasses, shrubs, tree branches, both living and dead tree branches. And spruce and fir stands actually have a lot of dead branches that can serve as fuel ladders. So look for fuel ladders and trim them. And look especially along our roadsides where they might butt against electrical wires. This is basically just showing, again, what would happen with a fuel fire down here on the surface. It goes up into these branches, and that's a fuel ladder. This is showing a fuel ladder. This I actually took in my own backyard. Back around the time where I did the first wildfire risk assessment back in 2020. And you can see there's lots of stuff on the ground that could be combustible and would go right up this tree. What I didn't show you in this photo is that right over about here is where my power generator is. So again, this could have been a fire ladder. Fortunately, I cleared that area out. Here's another classical fire ladder. This is a dead one that's sitting here. And look what it's under. Here's some power lines. Suppose this power line fell down and ignited the grasses that are down here on the floor. That fire would propagate directly up that fuel ladder. So deciduous trees are a bit more resistant to fire than some of the coniferous trees, and that's because they tend to have a higher water content, and their leaves are likely to retain some moisture. But their fallen leaves also tend to decompose fairly rapidly, and that would further reduce the fire risk. So hardwoods are not in general very flammable, but dead dry ash could burn. And again, we are now well into the emerald ash borer epidemic, and many of our ash trees are already dying or actually dead, and they'll eventually, particularly out in the forest, fall to the ground, and they could burn. Conifer needles are much more prone to fires, and again, we certainly have a ton of pines, and if you look at your rooftops almost any time of year, you can probably see a lot of pine needles there. And conifers tend to fall over when they die, so they often become coarse, woody debris, which is a fire risk. And of the conifers, white pine is probably the most flammable, followed by fir and then hemlock. Eastman does have some features that would help prevent spread of a wildfire. We have a complex road system that does provide some fire breaks. And the road system also provides access for fire crews that would have to come in with tanker trucks to fight a fire. Water could be pumped out of Eastman Pond to fight the fires. But what we don't know is the effect that the recent drought has had on water tables. That certainly could reduce the water reserves. So there are three important points from that 2025 UNH report. Leaves, fallen branches, and coarse woody debris are potential fires, especially where clumps of brush are found piled or stacked, and they probably should be broken down and spread out. The fire ladders, which I mentioned, and we need to pay a special attention to those fire ladders that are roadside. And the key point was also that we should leave at least a 30-foot safety zone around each and every home. And again, I'll show you some diagrams of that in a minute. There's a dilemma, though, about stacking versus spreading coarse woody debris. The UNH report says that clumps of brush that are found piled or stacked should be broken down and spread out. But there's this issue of volume versus surface area. Fuels that have a larger surface area compared to volume are actually easier to ignite. In fact, that's why you use twigs as kindling to light a fire. And dry grass, pine needles, dry leaves, twigs, and other dead brush actually burn faster than large logs or stumps. So fuels that are somewhat spaced out also dry faster, and dry faster than those that are packed tightly together. And that's because more oxygen is available to the thinned out fuel. And more tightly packed fuels also tend to retain more moisture, which would absorb the fire's heat. So again, there's this dilemma, should we stack or should we spread? Uh, so maybe the nature of the stack is the key factor. So this is showing slash that probably should be removed or spread. So you see lots of dead branches and trees here. We refer to that as slash, and that probably should be spread out. On the other hand, this slash could stay because again, it's not very likely to ignite and spread a surface fire. The UNH report, remember I said, says it should be broken down and spread out, but there are plenty of other things out there in the literature that cut and scatter should be used where fuel loads are light as opposed to heavy. And that may substantially increase surface fire behavior where slash is particularly concentrated. So again, what should we do with the slash? It depends. Treating the slash will break up the continuity of ground fuels, and there are several methods to treat slash. One is the slop and scatter, another is crush, pile, chip, and remove. Lop and scatter is really only used when slash is currently on the ground, and the slash you create from thinning or pruning is limited and non-continuous. So you've got some room to spread it out. And you can easily cut it up so all the woody material is within 2 feet of the ground, and there is space between the groups of slash. If the slash is continuous, meaning it's really spread out, or it's too deep to get within 2 feet of the ground, then you may have to pile, crush, chip, and remove the slash. That may be more appropriate there. And when piling your slash, keep your piles small. They should be no longer than about 10 feet by 10 feet by 6 feet high. Actually, I think 6 feet high is probably way too high. We probably ought to be looking at something not more than 2 to 3 feet. So when you're crushing slash, you want to keep it low to the ground, probably less than 2 feet above the ground. And when you're chipping, spread the chips out rather than piling them up. And burning slash piles is a common way to remove slash. But remember, you need a permit to burn things, and you need to be very careful that you have all the appropriate conditions if you're doing a slash fire. So again, fire breaks or fuel breaks are stretches of open land that are devoid of potential fuels, and that may help prevent spread of a fire. And in these areas, all vegetation and vegetation debris should be removed down to the mineral soil. So you need to cut down any woody shrubs, prune any trees, and remove any slash. And you might contain low vegetation if it's green and moist all year round. But there can still be trees standing there, but they ought to be at least 10 feet between their crowns, or even wider if they're on a slope of greater than 20%. And again, the size of fire breaks, they're usually placed along roads that have multiple users. And it'd be 100 feet wide on each side of the road, and along boundaries with neighbors, another 100 feet wide, 200 feet wide between neighboring structures, and public access areas probably a minimum of 200 feet wide. And if you're looking at something that's upslope of things like railroad tracks, probably a minimum of 100 feet, but probably greater on slopes. And Eastman has lots of slopes and trails or lots of roads and trails that actually do provide some fire breaks, but we may need to expand some of them or add some ditches. And we might want to add a fuel break along the top of a ridge as well. There are two important factors again, I mentioned in reducing the risk for serious wildfires: reduction of those surface fuels and reduction of the fuel ladders. So again, methods for reducing those serious fires. One are prescribed fires, which we probably will not do here at Eastman. Biological things like grazing. Actually, in some areas that are risk, they let basically sheep go out and graze. Mechanical things, breaking down the fuel loads, thinning trees, limbing trees, removing underbrush. And of these, really only that last one is a practical intervention for us here at Eastman. This is showing, again, the Forest Service does some prescribed fires. So here, this is what this area looked like. They did a prescribed fire, and look what happened several years later. Now you've got a lot of green, open, young forest there. Um, we're not going to talk really about deliberate landscape burning here because it's really not applicable here at Eastman. But you can trim fuel ladders. So here's somebody that's out there with a big saw who's trimming some of the limbs of this tree that could be part of a fuel ladder. And again, the most serious fires are, again, what we call canopy fires or crown fires. And they spread from these embers jumping from one tree to the next, and they no longer require any fuel down on the ground. And winds help spread those embers, including winds that are actually generated by the fire itself. Remember, we talked about that fire whirl, and the embers can come up and they spread from one to another. And these fires can actually jump across fire breaks. Again, that's what's happened out in the serious fires in the Los Angeles areas, where some of the fires are jumping right across fire breaks. And again, fire also spreads more easily up steep slopes. This is showing how removal of vegetation can reduce fire risk. So here's what, again, this is another National Park Service photograph. Here's what it looked like before. Here's what it looked like after they cleared out this area. And note that they did store some slash, but they spread these piles of slash out. Wildfire risk mitigation near your own home is very important, and you need to prevent both horizontal and vertical spread of the fire. So you need to implement a 30-foot safety zone around your home. That means removing any fuel ladders that are near the structures. So that would mean trimming branches or tall grasses. You need to look for branches that might be overhanging your chimney. Again, this is a classic example. I showed you this photo before. Here's a before and an after picture where all these things were potential fire risks, and afterward, the risk is reduced. So you need to create that 30-foot zone around your home. But that doesn't mean that you can't plant anything there. There are a bunch of relatively fire resistant or fire retardant plants that you can put there, but make sure you avoid invasive species. Typically, these are high moisture plants that grow close to the ground and have a very low sap or resin content. So you can check with your local nursery or a landscape contractor or the county's cooperative extension service to find out what fire resistant plants are suitable for your area. Actually, the closest list here is from Maine, and I've included the URL to that. And you can get that from the corresponding PowerPoint that'll be posted on the Eastman web portal. And in this 30-foot zone, make sure that you remove any fire hazards, especially large dead branches. Stone walls actually may help as well. And look for those fuel ladders that I pointed out at the periphery of your property. This is showing fire home zones. This is, again, a diagram that shows 3 important zones. The first zone is immediately around your home, up to about 5 feet out. The second zone is up to 30 feet. Remember, we mentioned you want to have this 30-foot zone, and the other zones are further out. So again, some have advocated that you have an even broader home ignition zone. But in that home zone, which would be your house and anything attached to it, and then the second zone, that 30-foot ring around your home, and then what some have called the green belt, which is out to 70 feet and even further out to 120 or anything beyond that. So from Firewise organization, here are some items that are important. You want to prune those hanging limbs to reduce those fuel ladders. You want to clean your roofs and gutters of pine needles and dead leaves. Keep any flammable plants and mulches at least 5 feet away from your home's perimeter. And use low-growing, well-pruned, fire-resistant plants in the landscaping around your home. You can screen or box in areas that are below patios or decks with some wire screening with no larger than 1/8 inch mesh. And you can sweep decks and porches clear of fallen leaves. Move any wood piles away from your home during non-winter months, and bring any doormats or furniture cushions inside when an area is threatened by a wildfire. And close your garage doors when you leave your home in the event of an evacuation. Uh, you want to ensure that the homes and neighborhoods have clearly legible fire street names. I'll talk about this a little bit more. This is still a problem at many areas here at Eastman. You always want to create at least two ways out of a neighborhood so you can safely evacuate if there is a wildfire emergency. I'll show you again a map. We have at least 4 exits to the Eastman community. You ought to be aware of how to get to any one of those. You want to create phone trees to alert residents about an impending fire or an actual fire. And you want to review any community rules or regulations on vegetation management. Make sure that they're FireWise friendly, and use the Ready, Set, Go program with the fire department to educate neighbors. Here are 5 things to consider in your neighborhood. Can the roads quickly and safely lead emergency personnel to a fire or burning structure? So remember, knocking down a fire is really critical to preventing it from spreading. So we need to make sure that the local fire department has access and that we're not blocking access to any fire that occurs. We want to make sure all the structure is in good condition, exterior walls in good condition, etc. What does that 30 feet of landscaping look like? The vegetation ought to be well cared for, and all dead, dying, or diseased plant material should be removed. And what does the landscape look like 100 feet or more outside of that? And does the community have an emergency plan in place? So when you remove vegetation, what do you do with them? Okay, here's how it's done in national parks. They either grind it into chips and spread it out, or they put it in piles and they burn it in winter when there's snow cover. And if you're replacing lost trees, or you want to plant hardwood, maple, poplar, or cherry trees that tend to be less flammable than pine, fir, and other conifer trees. So what are fire-resistant plants? Well, they have the following characteristics. Their leaves tend to be moist and supple. They have little dead wood and tend not to accumulate dry dead material. And the sap is more water-like and doesn't have a strong odor. And I mentioned before, the closest list of fire-resistant plants comes from Maine, and that's a good source to look for. What about bark mulch? Firebrands or the glowing embers from a wildfire or from cigarettes can ignite dry bark mulch. So again, if you have dry mulch right next to your home, that's a fire risk. And if you landscape with bark mulch up against your home, make sure that it stays moist. Better yet, remove that bark mulch and replace it with a fire-resistant ground cover. You may also consider using less flammable types of mulch, such as gravel or decorative rock, or a combination of wood bark mulch and decorative rock. Here's something very interesting. Can mushrooms prevent megafires? Again, we said slash piles present the fire risk themselves. And when slash piles burn, they burn longer and hotter than most wildfires over a much more concentrated area. And this leaves behind kind of a blistered soil with native vegetation that is going to struggle for decades to take root. So foresters thinning the forests have tried chipping trees on site, spreading mulch across the floor, and it really degrades at a snail's pace. Otherwise, some slash is removed. It could be used for biomass heating systems, but it's very costly to carry that slash out. So is there an alternative? And that alternative could be mushrooms. It's very interesting. Fungus actually has an uncommon knack for transformation. Give it garbage, plastic, even corpses, it'll convert everything into something else, such as nutrient rich soil. So mycologists, basically people who are experts in mushrooms, have shown that saprophytic fungi accelerate degradation of slash to soil. And unlike fire, which destroys nitrogen, fungi actually return nitrogen to the soil, which is important for growth of plants. So there was an experiment where they've been brewing up basically a mushroom mixture into a liquid, and they're spraying it across multiple acres to see if this will actually prevent fires. So it's very interesting. So someday down the line, we may be spraying our slash piles with this magic mushroom elixir. So there's some other issues here at Eastman. Barbecue grills on patios are a risk. Fire pits are a risk. Large clumps of brush and woody debris. Cigarette butts being thrown out. So remember, only you can prevent forest fires. So you need to know your daily risk. You need to have a fire permit to build any fire, and you must know if it's safe to build a fire on a specific day. And barbecue grills should not be used on patios or other wooden structures. And when you're using permitted fire pits, make sure that the sparks are not wafting up toward dry pine needles. Make sure that you completely extinguish all fires. And there should be no smoking on trails or when you're hiking in the woods. You've seen signs like this. That assessment that was done here in 2005 said that we have a low wildfire risk, and any fire would likely be a ground fire rather than a surface fire. And that's because Eastman doesn't really have a whole abundance of ground fuels. We don't see large areas where there are grasses, particularly dry grasses that are fairly widespread. So we don't have meadows and things like that. Most of the fuels here that occur on the ground would require really hot fire to ignite. And ground fuels that are easily combustible and likely to ignite in a dry situation are things like grasses. And once again, we don't have a whole lot of grasses here at Eastman. But we do need to educate our residents on wildfire risks and mitigation. And we need to use our trail and woodland monitoring programs to look for some of these risks. I mentioned house numbers before. That assessment that was done in 2005 said that all the streets and addresses should be clearly marked. That's important. One winter, a couple winters ago, I was out walking the dog and I saw some sparks that were coming from a transformer on top of a utility pole. I contacted Eversource and they wanted to know the exact address of the place where those sparks were. They weren't satisfied with the general location, and the house with the utility pole didn't have a visible house number. So I had to actually go to the tax GIS map on the Grantham website to find that house number. So in responding, when we first started addressing the emerald ash borer epidemic, we offered a service where we went out to various properties to try to identify ash trees for our residents and homeowners. And while doing that, I was stunned at the number of properties that didn't have readily available or readily visible house numbers that were visible from the road. So we can actually do a better job there. Think what a delay for first responders it would mean if they couldn't find the address that they were asked to respond to for a fire, or for that matter, a medical emergency. So your checklist for homeowners: make sure your gutters are free of litter and other debris. Keep your tree limbs from extending within 10 feet of the flue or opening of any stove or your chimney. Cap all chimneys and stovepipes with mesh screening that shouldn't be bigger than half an inch. Make sure that your landscape vegetation is kept away from your house. Look for fuel ladders in your backyard, and especially are there any conifer trees that would burn and lead the flame upward toward the forest canopy. Flammable liquids and things like natural gas should be stored properly and not haphazardly. And you should have fire tools handy. That would include a ladder that would reach a roof, a shovel, a rake, and a watering system that should include a hose and a bucket. You need to stack any firewood well away from your home and make sure that your house number is posted where it's easily visible from the road. Do you see fuel ladders forming or that have formed already on your property? Do you notice the buildup of dry fuels like grasses on your property? And are there things that strike you as odd or unsafe with regards to a fire? So, have you encountered anything out of the ordinary, like fuel cans that are positioned close to dry fuels, open fire pits, or other things that you think might pose a fire threat? And again, all streets and home addresses should be clearly marked. We also need to design and build fire-wise structures. So that would include things like treated roof shakes and shingles as well. Wildfire response, what will we do? Well, we need to educate the community on wildfire risk and prevention. We need to look at fire hazards when we're hiking or trail keeping. Uh, should we erect a fire hazard dial similar to the one that's in front of the fire hall across from the post office? Uh, or should we just put something up uh, shortly before when the conditions are for a high fire risk? My concern is that when we put the daily fire dial up there, we have a tendency to ignore it. If we're seeing it every day, we probably don't pay as much attention to it. We might actually do better having something that's up there on a regular or only as needed basis. So what should Eastman's board do? Well, we need to disseminate this information to all homeowners, renters, and visitors. And the ECC guidelines always should make sure that we allow for that 30-foot zone around the homes where we don't need to get ECC approval to remove those trees. And we need to have regulations regarding the slash pile height and nature and allow uplimbing of trees when they're within that 30-foot zone. So once again, and we need to encourage our homeowners to create that 30-foot safety zone around their home. And we probably should have a telephone tree or a Twitter messaging tree or equivalent so that we can alert all Eastman residents in case of a fire. And we need obviously to work with the towns of Grantham, Enfield, and Springfield to update any response plans for wildfires. In terms of signage, once again, we want to make sure that street names are all apparent, and we need to mandate that those address numbers be readily visible from all properties. We probably should have GPS coordinates of each property available readily as well. And we need to ensure that fire ladders, particularly along the roads, are mitigated. And at any time, we should consult with UNH, New Hampshire Fish and Game, etc., about potential fire breaks or risk fire corridors. And consider requiring any new builds or renovations on old homes adopt fire-wise principles, including things like having treated roof shakes and shingles. So what each Eastman homeowner needs to do. So once again, make sure that everybody in your household and any guests understand the risk for wildfires. You should be aware of your daily fire risk. Should build fires only if you have a permit and the conditions allow it. Create that 30-foot safety zone around your house and your buildings. Look for fuel ladders on your property and remove them, including uplimbing trees. Avoid large clumps of brush or woody debris, and plant fire-resistant plants in those zones immediately around your home. Make sure that your house number is readily visible from the street. Make sure that your gutters are free of leaf litter and other debris. And keep any tree limbs from extending within 10 feet of your chimney or the flue to any stove. And cap your chimneys and stovepipes. So again, any flammable liquids and natural gas ought to be stored safely. Keep those fire tools handy. We talked about that. Actually, you already saw this, but call 911 immediately if you see a fire. And that means call 911 rather than calling um, Eastman Security. And have an emergency plan for all your family and guests in the event of a fire, including if you evacuate, knowing where you're going to meet your family after that evacuation. And know your potential exit routes. Make sure that your house number is posted where it's readily visible. Eastman maintenance needs to keep their eyes open for these fire ladders that are adjacent to the roads and identify any fuel hazards that are seen along some of. And once again, all streets need to be clearly marked. So other recommendations, again, we talked about the 30 feet, and we need to encourage homeowners to create that 30-foot safety zone. And the ECC should allow uplimbing of any trees that constitute potential fuel ladders. And we should recommend that piles of coarse woody debris be no longer than 3 feet, 2 to 3 feet in high, and not be bigger than 10 feet by 10 feet. And once again, the board should mandate those address numbers being readily visible. So if a fire does occur, one important lesson from the Lahaina fire in Maui and the Los Angeles fires was that fires can rekindle. The Palisades fire in Los Angeles may have reignited from some scorch marks that were left by an earlier fire that was set off by fireworks on New Year's Eve. And strong winds may have reignited that fire even 6 days after it was originally put out. And the same thing happened in Maui. That original fire that occurred early in the morning was thought to be completely extinguished, but it rekindled later on, probably after the strong winds moved some dirt and uncovered burning embers. So researchers have found that fires can smolder in plant roots or other organic material for several days, and windy conditions may allow them to reignite. So it's really critical, even after a fire is extinguished, that we remain vigilant for potential rekindling. So wildfires are not all bad. They typically destroy old forest and lead to new growth, which is important. That creates more diversity. Forest patches of varying age and size are very good. And we need to reduce the fires actually reduce the accumulated fuel load, such as underbrush, and it creates new habitat for wildlife. So, for instance, animals like rabbits and hares and deer need to be able to have low-lying vegetation that they can feed on. Eastman's forests are very mature, so we have a lot of high forests, which not as much understory. So again, the deer need to be able to reach those food sources. And small wildfires can also benefit many bird species because, again, beetles come in droves after a wildfire, and woodpeckers and other birds like to feast on those beetles and other insects. So fires are actually nature ways of clear cutting or select cutting to regenerate the forest. So again, snags are basically dead standing trees. And snags provide habitat for insects, birds, and some cavity dwelling animals. So they're actually pretty good. Fallen branches and trees can also provide habitat for some species. And fallen trees and branches also put carbon and minerals and nutrients back in the soil, and that's important for future growth. So traditionally, we recommend fallen trees and branches to stay on the ground floor. But big splash piles and fuel ladders don't provide much benefit to the habitat. So what about emerald ash borer? Again, it's now been present for several years here at Eastman, and we're getting to the stage where we're starting to see some trees actually dying. So branches are falling from the white ash trees, and eventually these are going to fall down. Now, we usually just leave these in place if they fall out in the forest, but ash can dry out and it could burn. So the emerald ash borer may somewhat increase our fire risk. Uh, we've been trying to identify ash trees. We've tried to help many homeowners identify them so they can decide which trees to take down and which ones they might want to treat with insecticides to preserve. And traditionally, again, if ash trees fall in the forest and don't pose a risk to a person or property, we simply allow them to fall and stay on the ground. And that's because they do put nutrients back into the soil and may provide habitat for some wildlife. But fallen ash trees eventually could pose a threat. So we need to keep our eyes open there. So again, we're now probably almost 4 years into the emerald ash borer epidemic, and we don't know what's going to happen. So should we do anything different now? I'm just going to skip through this. It's really not clear. The bottom line is we don't know the answer to this. But again, keeping moisture levels at a good level is probably a good idea. So are there natural firefighters? Yes, beavers. When a fire goes through, animals know where to go. They head toward a beaver habitat. So typically a beaver pond, and the beavers are legendary rodents, and they create fireproof refuges. And so we need to embrace the beavers here at Eastman. We've done a lot of things about beavers. This is showing an area that was out at, I think this was Idaho, where there was a big wildfire. And look, all the vegetation in the forest has been destroyed, with the exception of the area around the beaver pond. So again, beavers, in fact, are good firefighters. So again, in terms of wildfire risk alerts, again, you need to put out a regular update. You can subscribe to get emails at this URL. Eastman and Grantham are in fire danger rating area number 3. You can also see the current fire risk every day on that sign that's out in front of the local fire department across from the post office. And again, this is just a map showing the fire risk areas. We're down here in number 3. So that's one. I'm kind of missing one thing here. I talked about the exit routes. In terms of the exit routes, I did have a map, but you can't see it right now. And there are 4 exits and entrances to Eastman. One, the kind of southwest entrance, is the main entrance to Eastman, which you're all familiar with. The second one is the north entrance, which is up Draper Road area. The other 2 are on the east side. One is you take Bear Drive out to Bog Road, and the other one is kind of on the southeast side. And that one you have to take Wellfield to get on Winding Wood Road, and that takes you to Eastman Access Road, which also gets you to Bog Road. So you need to be familiar with how to get to those various exits. So that's a little bit about wildfire risk management. Again, hopefully we're never going to see a wildfire here at Eastman, but given all the things that have happened throughout the country and throughout the world, the risk will only increase in the future. So it's important that you know what to do. Thanks.